I want to thank the organizers for this invitation. I've recently also become a board member of Ophea, which I'm really excited about because as far as I'm concerned, it links me to policy, which is where most of my work lies now, but it also links me directly to people on the ground, yourselves, the people who are in the schools, who are making contact with the future leaders of this nation. So I get really excited about that because most of the time right now I spend my time talking to federal officials and our partners in the nonprofit sector. I'm also a board member for the Aboriginal Sports Circle, and I never really know where those conversations go. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're a real struggle. I also want to thank the organizers for offering up that land acknowledgement about the Haudenosaunee and being on Anishinaabe land, because it's recognition of the people who originally occupied these lands. And as a Canadian and also as a member of the Fisher River Cree First Nation, that's in Manitoba, it's about 2 hours north of Winnipeg. I think these land acknowledgements are important because it raises the obvious question of what happened between now and then. That's what the land acknowledgement does for me. And what I mean by now and then is when the people occupied the lands as part of their traditional territories to the time they moved on to reserves or settlements, or not, when they lost their identity and moved into the towns and cities. So it raises the obvious question for me of what happened between now and then. And I'm going to try and show you today, as physical education teachers, how your field, how physical education is implicated in that history of between then and now, because it is. There are three questions that I want to take a look at that I proposed in my abstract. One is, how are physical education teachers to understand the TRC reports, the Truth and Reconciliation reports that came out in 2015? How is physical education tied to colonialism? And I'm not going to put value judgments on that today because too often, I think we enter into contexts where this becomes a real emotionally charged space. And I've been here long enough that I try and remove that emotionally charged space because we need to be able to talk about colonialism because we are all implicated in it. And what can physical education teachers do to address the calls to action? So the introduction that I wrote about myself is where I talked about the work that I do. I'm a historian who uses sociological concepts, and I take a look at the way physically active bodies, and that includes all of the different ways that our bodies have been taught to be physically active: sport, recreation, physical activities, physical education, physically active bodies. How the physically active body and the tools that have been used to train our bodies that way have been used as tools for colonization or socialization, if you want to use that term, or if you're looking at the new Physical Activity Act. I've had a chance to look at the draft, and they use social engineering and some really other very interesting terms that I would never think policy makers would use. But it's growing awareness of the way in which our bodies are used as tools, and how different groups of people, including Indigenous people, are taking up those same tools that were used for colonization to decolonize that same process for what we call regeneration and survival. Now, I came into this job really by accident. I grew up in Northern Ontario, in Timmins. My family moved around a lot. My mother has her membership in Fisher River, as do I, and my father. My biological father is Cree, so I like to say I'm your quintessential Métis, which Métis scholars, of course, get all up in arms about because I don't belong to the Red River Settlement, which is the capital M Métis. But because of the way history worked out, I have First Nation status with treaty rights. It's a very complicated process. So as you may or may not know, there are three distinct political groups in Canada: the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. But the local designations are always the most important. That is probably the one piece of advice that I would give to anybody who is going to enter into discussions with Aboriginal or Indigenous people. Aboriginal you usually use to refer to people who are in Canada. Indigenous is the political term that people use to refer to groups worldwide, although there is now a movement to refer to Indigenous people in Canada as Indigenous, so it's kind of complicated. The best thing to do is always just to refer to local designations, and if you don't know, ask. It's really simple. How do you identify? Well, you know, my family's from Fisher River Cree, but I'm Aboriginal. You can call me First Nations. I'm okay with that. Some people are more adamant in their politics, so it's always good to ask. But I came into this job by accident, growing up in Timmins. You know what? I wasn't the greatest of students. I was one of those students who kind of checked out most of the time, and oftentimes I didn't go to class. What was I doing, as my parents would want to know? I was running. I was being physically active. Growing up in Timmins, being Aboriginal, being female in a working class kind of town wasn't the easiest place to grow up. People thought I would be a secretary, or maybe I'd end up working at Tim Hortons. That is what they thought I would do. And I aspired to the job of secretary because I was going to be the best damn secretary Timmins had ever seen. My mother was a great secretary. And so I thought, you know, well, what do I need to really go to school for? You know, all I need to do is to get through. And I wanted to do sports because it was a way for me to travel out of Timmins. The first thing that you want to do when you're a teenager in Timmins is get out of town, right? So I would spend a lot of the time running, and I didn't realize how routine I was until one day I didn't show up in class, and I guess my teachers and the guidance counselor finally got frustrated, and they called my mother to tell her I wasn't in class, and my mother got worried and called the police. And the next thing you know, there's an APB out for me, and within a couple of hours, they'd actually traced my running route that I did on a regular basis. So they knew exactly where I was at certain points in time. So when I got to university, I squeaked into university. Again, I wasn't the greatest of students. I didn't know what I was doing there, but I joined the varsity teams, cross-country running, track and field, badminton. And so I'm a 3-star athlete at Western. And it was then that I realized, you know what, if I could merge somehow my love for history with my love for athletics, then I would find a way. And I'm one of those people who just hung on long enough and who was tenacious enough to make that way. So I'm your sport historian who uses sociological concepts to study Aboriginal sport practices, and I happen to be lucky enough to find my place in this space today. I want to start with 2 openings. You know, I love openings. I want to start with 2. And I'm going to start with media. And I'm going to do this for a reason, which I hope you'll see come together in a couple of minutes. I'm going to start with this news article from March 2014. And this news article is from CBC, which is, I hope you know, the largest public news source in Canada. And in 2014, they published this article with a stirring title. You can see it there, How Hockey Offered Salvation at Indian Residential Schools. The article featured Aboriginal lawyer and member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation in Alberta, J. Wilton Littlechild. He's one of the 3 commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was the national investigative body that was established by the federal government in June of 2008 to document the history of the Indian residential schools from mostly the perspective of the students, because their perspectives had been left out of other investigations that had occurred before that. Although the TRC wouldn't complete its mandate until December 2015, so about a year and a half later, the record it had amassed by March 2014 already made clear that the Indian residential school system was structured around endemic patterns of abuse and was governed by violence, repression, and poverty. And of course, it left behind a legacy that we're trying to address now, and it will take generations to address and transcend. But this article left me wondering, as the scholar, how are readers, how are Canadians to understand the role of sport and physical education in the Indian residential school system? Was it really a means for salvation, as the title is proposing here? Now, if you look up salvation on the internet, in the dictionary, or if you go to synonyms, you can see alternate words are liberation, emancipation, even rescuing. So after acknowledging the trauma experienced by the students, the CBC article assures readers that the TRC was also, and I'm quoting, hearing positive stories about Canada's national game. So by virtue of the positive effects, according to the article, sport, and especially hockey, the national game, stood apart from the school's broader program of assimilation, framing sport as one of the few redeeming cultural practices taught at school, and positioning the successful athlete Willie Littlechild as a symbol of a feel-good story, offering a kind of antidote to this deeply troubling past. Littlechild is quoted as saying, "Hockey was the one bright light of a positive experience for students." So given Littlechild's role in the TRC as one of 3 commissioners and his 14 years of schooling in 2 different Indian residential schools, as well as his lifelong commitment to Aboriginal sport development, I've known Willie for a long time, and he's one of the founders, for instance, of the North American Indigenous Games, which you may have heard about. What Littlechild has to say about sport and the Indian residential school system carries weight. But in conjuring up this feel-good story, much was made about the students building rinks, skating on lakes, practicing daily, going on road trips, calling to mind images of a romantic past filled with friendships, free times, and special privileges. These are images that hockey loves to conjure up, of a romantic Canadian past, of free time on the ponds. You see it all the time in Tim Hortons commercials. There's a short documentary-style interview with Littlechild that accompanies this article. You can click on it if you want, if you go online and find it yourself. And it extends this romantic imagery, shoring up these assumptions that sports are inherently good and that they should be celebrated uncritically rather than assessing its assimilative qualities. Nowhere in this article is there any mention of physical education. This is a story about sport, and hockey specifically. So, my second opening. What about the TRC reports then? How is sport and perhaps physical education talked about or represented in the reports that came out in 2015? Well, how many of you have actually read the reports, just out of curiosity? Kinda, probably? Because, I mean, there's a lot of documents, right? And if you've read the 2 histories, it's like thousands of pages almost. It's a massive, massive piece of work. But if you go through it, and I have, similar to media, the TRC offers a too narrow interpretation of sport and physical education. And it's far less critical than the other institutions that it investigated, including things like health, child welfare, and education. This narrow, less critical interpretation or orientation is reflected in the subtitles that are used to describe the 3 sections in the executive summary where sport is discussed. Now, here are the 3 subtitles. 1, sport and culture, it was a relief. The other, public memory, dialogue, the arts, and commemoration. And 3, sport, inspiring lives, healthy communities. So sport is framed positively in the TRC. I've pulled out a quote just to show you, give you an example of what it talks about. Sport helps students to make it through residential school by making their lives more bearable and giving them a sense of identity, accomplishment, and pride. Now, I've heard it framed differently in the interviews that I've conducted, and I've conducted probably more than 50 with residential school survivors since 2000. That's how long I've been working on this project in different sorts of veins. And usually I hear it more as it's a temporary form of escape from the pain. Now, this is qualitatively different than saying sport was a positive experience. It's a temporary escape from the pain. And the stories that I could tell you are incredible, of the ways in which residential school survivors experienced sport in the residential school and then came to weave it into their lives afterwards. So we have this relief, commemoration, inspiration framing in the TRC. And this stands out in sharp relief to the cutting edge, cutting analytical perspective elsewhere in the document. So this should lead us to ask then, what do we mean, or what is meant by reconciliation? How do we operationalize the TRC principles, especially in the context of physical education? Well, if we go to the executive summary for the TRC reports, there's a general framework for understanding what reconciliation means. And it says, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respective relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. That's great, but it's not very helpful. It goes on to say, in order for that to happen, it gets better, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. As a researcher, I can see how that's very true, but it also is emotionally laden, and I have been in environments where it is important to go through those emotions. As a researcher, though, I tend to focus on awareness of the past because education is the thing that I do. And in my service work, then I deal with the implementation of that awareness. In other words, the relationship between the state and Aboriginal people is still a colonial one, and it's embedded in unequal power relations that limit Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities from reaching their full potential. That is why the executive summary goes on to say, we are not there yet, because the power imbalance still needs to be addressed. But even with its oversimplistic interpretation of sport and physical education in the TRC reports, the reports offer two main points worth considering for reconciliation. One is that any understanding of how we got here must be viewed in the context of Canada's colonial history. And that view will open up the doors for greater possibilities. It will free us for more creative thinking. It will lead to a better understanding of how those power relations need to be addressed. And of course, too, is that action must flow from that new understanding, and that this action must align with Aboriginal aspirations. What are those aspirations, you ask? Well, a good starting point is to go to the 94 Calls to Action, one of the reports in the suite of reports from the TRC. This is the document that outlines what needs to be done to begin addressing the power imbalance. The calls to action are divided into sections that align very nicely with public policy interests, like child welfare, education, language and culture, and health. And if you scroll to the very end of the document, in the back pages, you will find sport. I think it just got layered on, and then people got tired. That's sort of my interpretation, and they didn't apply the critical lens to sport. That's my very generous offer. I'll offer another orientation at the end. So here we have the 94 calls to action. There are 5 items for sport and reconciliation, and it is sport and reconciliation, not physical education. And you can see generally what these interests are. I've paraphrased them for you. If you go to the calls to action, they are much more aligned with like policy speak, and so they are quite boring to read. You can see, perhaps for your interest, health and well-being is mentioned only once, and if you go to the actual call to action 89, it is mentioned only in passing. So it's not the main concern here. Nowhere in the calls to action is physical education mentioned. Not once. It's not mentioned in the section on sport. It's not mentioned in the section on education. I think this is a curious omission and a really problematic one, considering the role of physical education in Canada's colonialism and the role that physical educators and physical education can play in helping to make Canada a better place. And what I hear happening at Ophea is generally working towards that. So this is what we call, in the university system in sociology, the presence of the absence. Because it is often what goes unsaid that is the most significant. People are only able to articulate what they think is a problem, and often they don't want to deal what is even more of a problem. This is the presence of the absence. What is often unsaid is the most problematic, is the most important. So, with this shared understanding of what reconciliation means, how do we apply that concept to physical education? What needs to be reconciled in physical education, and why does it need to be reconciled? Well, sport and recreation and physical education and physical activities, these what I call physical cultural practices, are tools for socialization. That means that they inculcate certain values and behaviors in the population. In other words, physical cultural practices mean a lot to the people who practice them, and most often they mean so much that these values often go unstated. They mean so much that the values often go unstated. It becomes part of a person's habitus. It becomes part of a population's habitus. The physical cultural practices are used to construct and reinforce what is important to a particular culture, which means that our bodies and our physical practices become complex spaces of negotiation. We teach ideas about race and class and gender and nation in our physical practices. The way we move our bodies come to mean something. Now, it's not like you walk into your physical education classrooms, into the gyms and go, okay, today, boys and girls, we're going to do social engineering, and we're going to practice race, or we're going to practice class-based activities. Let's do that. You don't do that. Or at least I don't think you do. That would be a really interesting space. Instead, there are assumptions and there are meanings that are woven into those practices, that are embedded in those practices that get taught and reinforced through what gets taught in the classroom. Some of the values and meanings that get attached to some practices might be challenged or even subverted by the people who are engaging in those activities. For instance, consider the sport of basketball. If you take a look out onto a basketball court and you see athletes or students in a basketball court playing that game, there are all sorts of assumptions that people make when they see these bodies moving in formation, doing things that you understand, wrapped around rules. People assume that they're playing the same game with the same intent, that they all adhere to the same values that are attached to playing that game. But one group might value the performance outcomes of the game. They're very interested in the scores, in the outcome of the game, where it sits in relation to other games, versus the other team, which might be more interested in just participation, the values wrapped around that, inclusion. Both groups might excel at playing basketball, but the values they attach to playing the game differ. And these differences lead to distinct ways of organizing and funding the activity. So one team does things differently than the other, but as an observer, you might not see those differences. You just might see two teams playing basketball and make assumptions about what you see on the court. So we need to recognize that meanings have always been attached to physically active bodies. Movements and movement culture mean something to the participants and to the observers. Sometimes these values have value-laden approaches attached to it. Consider the notion of progress as part of physical activities. It's safe to assume that you have your own measurement tools to assess student progress in physical education, rewarding certain types of values and behaviors over others, which means the others are marginalized and discouraged. And students come to understand what is appropriate physical activity for classrooms. In other words, they come to understand, without even saying a word, what counts as appropriate physical activity and what falls outside the scope of those boundaries. What people tend to forget is that preferences for physical activities are what we call culturally arbitrary. This means that each activity is valuable and meaningful in its own context. It is not better or worse than the other. It's just that it means something different in its context. I often use the example of the Olympic Games and the 1904 Olympic Games, Anthropology Days, as a really good example. And I don't know if you know the story around this, but in 1904, Olympic organizers brought in Indigenous people from different parts of the world. They were situated at the World Fair. They were meant to live in camps, put on display for the observers. And they were brought over by the Olympic organizers down the road, and they were meant to engage in settler activities. So the settlers had brought with them different games, such as track and field, which the Indigenous people didn't have experience with. And the organizers wanted to know, who is the better athlete, because there were assumptions around being a more advanced nation at that point, around who is the better athlete, who has the better athletes. We see similar assumptions today in the Olympic Games about the top nations in the world. And of course, the Indigenous athletes didn't know how to do these activities, and so they didn't do very well. And then the organizers went off to their own scientific conference and wrote up about how the Indigenous people were not very good athletes, and this showed how they were uncivilized, and a lot of work needed to be done in order to educate them about being civilized and so on. So in colonial contexts, some forms of physical activities are deemed better. That's to say that physical activities in the physically active body is invested with meaning. And this meaning-making process, this investment process, is neither innocent nor arbitrary, making physically active bodies and your physical education classes highly contested sites where power relations are constructed, reinforced, and challenged, sometimes without people even knowing. Colonial officials were not unaware of the power of sport and recreation to change lives, nor were Aboriginal people unaware of these efforts, and they often resisted these colonizing attempts and adapted the activities to meet their own needs and aspirations, often in limited ways because they didn't control the rules and resources for what were being offered. Let me give you some examples. Imagine we're 100 years or so into the past, and you depended on the land for survival. Now think about this. This is really fun. How many of you have seen the movie Revenant? The Revenant. Okay, good. Okay, so think about the movie The Revenant. Imagine you're 100 or so years into the past, and you depended on the land for your survival. Think, what physical skills and competencies would you need to survive? Would you need to get by? What physical skills and competencies would you need to get your food, to make your clothing, to build your shelter? Think about this for a minute. Think about the movie The Revenant. Now you're going to go and watch the movie The Revenant. Or at least you're going to have a better understanding of it. It's a great movie, actually, for physical education teachers and for history teachers. Well, if this is what you said, then you'd be on the right track. For instance, you would need endurance. You need it for running short and long distances, for chasing game, and for protection. You need it for strength, for carrying or hauling items, such as carrying food, building shelter, warfare. You need power, which is strength plus speed, for taking down game, for protection, and for building. You need accuracy for hunting and for warfare. You need balance for traveling over uneven terrain. I do this with my students. I go through the slide and I say, have you ever tried to run in the woods on fresh snow and see how far you make it? There's a really good experience of what life on the land is like. You need pain tolerance. People underestimate the value of pain tolerance because you need to keep on with survival. If you break your arm or your leg or a bone, or if you hurt yourself or you're sick in the woods, living on the land, you have to keep on or you die. It's simple. You need pain tolerance. This is a valued competency. So physical skills and games were used to develop these competencies. Indigenous people had their own whole kind of suite of physical culture that they engaged in when they lived on the land, which meant that these physical skills and competencies were central to training for a hard life on the land, because life was friggin' hard. I mean, it's not romantic at all. It is hard. It is about survival. So it's more than fun pastimes, these activities, these physical games and contests. They served specific functions. We can see some of these that have been transposed into the present day. If you know the Arctic Winter Games, there's a suite of Indigenous games in those events. The Dene Games are a similar major event that are wrapped around Indigenous cultural practices. Those were originally Indigenous games and contests that were used for survival on the land that have been transposed into a modern-day competitive format. So they were essential for survival. They were required, I'm using sporting terminology, training for life on the land. But they also reinforced Indigenous connections to the land because the land was their home. Home meant traveling on the land. It wasn't limited to one definitive spot. Now, it's not important not to confuse traveling on the land with being a nomad, for instance. Indigenous people didn't just wander the land aimlessly without direction. They had clear ties to different parts of the land, which meant they had a rich and detailed understanding of the land that they lived on, of their traditional territories. They knew exactly where they were going based on knowledge handed down through the generations, and that is why the Europeans depended on them when they arrived. They needed them for survival, because Indigenous people knew how to get from one place to the next without calamity. They knew which parts of the land to traverse and when, and which parts to avoid. They knew where to get the game or fish, the edible berries and the shrubs, and the good materials for shelter. They knew how to read the land they were on. Their home was the land that they traversed. And that is why state relocation programs, often to access natural resources, failed miserably, because Indigenous people knew nothing about the new land that they were on. One iceberg is not the same as the next, just as one piece of forest is not the same as the next, and so on. Through the 1800s and the early 1900s, this connection to the land was undercut by the development of the nation state. Indigenous people, weakened by disease, starvation, and warfare, were displaced onto reserves and settlements, so that the games and contests that once sustained their land-based lifestyles no longer served the same purpose or carried the same meaning. And it was during this era that settlers began to impose their own definitions of appropriate physical behavior, using policies and legislation to enforce their views. This is why I chose policy as one of the main areas to work in, because I realized the importance of policies. Everything from Aboriginal subsistence lifestyles to religious customs came under attack. Even early Canadian recreation anglers, fishermen, attempted to impose their own definition of appropriate sport fishing. They used their access to political power to secure their right to engage in sport fishing while curtailing Aboriginal rights to fish and hunt for subsistence by claiming that Aboriginal ways of fishing, using spears and gill nets, for instance, were uncivilized and harmed the environment. So here you can see a value-laden judgment connected to a scientific rationale. It was uncivilized, the value-laden judgment, and it harmed the environment, the scientific rationale. What anglers didn't realize or acknowledge was that Aboriginal fishing methods were actually highly efficient. Spearing was more effective than angling, for instance, as a means of selecting fish by size and class. And if you fish, you'll understand what that means. But it was the Canadian anglers' views and competing definitions of appropriate sporting behavior that became enshrined in Canadian legislation, and it remains an obstacle to this day for Aboriginal subsistence practices. The move to gain control over Aboriginal economic subsistence activities was soon followed by prohibitions against traditional religious ceremonies. Missionaries and colonial officials expressed frustration at what they saw as the lack of spiritual and economic growth among Aboriginal people. And they attributed the problem not to their own cultural biases or to the impoverished environments that Aboriginal people had been forced into, but to Aboriginal people's own participation in their backward religious customs. And they characterized such customs as the potlatch and the Sundance, and here you see an image of the Sundance from 1906, as deviant and immoral, saying it left Aboriginal people poor and were counterproductive to Christian conversion. Many Indigenous customs revolved around the redistribution of goods, since the people were communal. They also frequently involved the destruction of property as forms of cultural expression that confirmed and maintained social and family relations. But these practices challenged European notions of ownership and thrift that lay at the heart of the growing capitalist economy. During this era, settler sports and games were used to impose such redefinitions on Indigenous people. This is when we see the emergence of sports days on reserves. These celebrations became a popular feature across many reserves in Canada. There developed a fairly robust intra- and inter-community competition that were encouraged and funded by Indian agents and federal officials, Indian Affairs, who sought to create an appreciation for more reasonable amusements, and that term is actually used in documents during this era. Reasonable amusements, ones that aligned with dominant understandings of work, appropriate work and leisure, and the separation of the two. Some Indigenous people carried on their cultural traditions, either in secret or as a private exercise, or within a framework that positioned their traditional practices more as entertainment than ceremonies that were vital to their overall well-being. The powwows at Banff Indian Days is a really good example of this. When the young people were placed into schools, beginning en masse in the mid-1800s, the connection they had to the land, to their identities, and to their entire way of life was further ruptured. Here, too, settler sports and games were integral to the program of assimilation, and sport served a number of ideological and practical functions for the residential school system. One, it helped with discipline. It was to train wild children on how to use their leisure time properly. It also served as a form of propaganda to showcase the work that was being done by the church and state in the schools. And it was also used for retention, to keep children and families interested in schooling and to decrease the number of runaways. There are many instances in the archives that I've seen where school officials state that sport was more effective than the classroom in bringing about fundamental changes in the values and behaviors of the students. So discipline and regimentation in the pursuit of cultural change was a key feature of the Indian residential school system, and physical education was well suited to the disciplinary nature of schooling, where administrators used in the late 1800s and early 1900s, actually right up until World War II, military drill and calisthenics and gymnastics. And this was done to instill respect for authority and obedience among the students. There was little to no room for self-expression in these exercises, and students were required to move in unison as a leader called out the appropriate commands. Military drill was for the boys, and both boys and girls did gymnastics. Many schools employed these activities until World War II, after which time Indian Affairs began to increase its promotion of physical education within the school system. So changes are characterized by changes to the Indian Act in 1951. Now, the Indian Act is the federal kind of statute that oversees, that regulates the federal involvement in Indian lives. But these changes to the Indian Act in 1951 characterized the federal approach towards Indian education. And the policy approach taken before and after 1951 shaped the types of opportunities that were available. As the federal policy on Indian education shifted, so too did its emphasis on the types of activities that were offered in the schools. Generally, the more the government focused on assimilation, because that's what happened with the 1951 changes to the Indian Act, that is formally when the government began the unwinding of the Indian residential school, with the last school closed in 1996. But the more the government began to focus on assimilation, the more important organized sport and physical education became to its overall agenda. And in 1950, Indian Affairs hired a man by the name of Jan Eisenhart as the department's first ever supervisor of physical education and recreation. And I was actually a very good friend of Jan Eisenhart when he passed away in 1941. So thus began the formal entry of the federal government into physical education for assimilation in the Indian residential school system. Ideas about muscular Christianity, It's a British concept that was focused on the development of good Christians through sports and games by instilling character traits such as courage, toughness, self-reliance, and sportsmanship were infused throughout the discussions of physical education in the Indian residential school system. So, what do you do with all of this? Wow, it's a big one. First of all, the TRC brought much needed attention to sport and physical education as important elements to the Indian residential school system and to residential school experiences. But it is not the first time that it did this. If you go back to 1996 and even commissions before that into the 1950s, physical education and sport have always been mentioned throughout these documents. So what we have is this long policy trail of physical education, sport and recreation being important, not only to these federal objectives, but to Aboriginal lives. There is a clear paper trail. Another important takeaway, and this is really important, is that the TRC is not about residential schools. People often don't think deeply enough about the TRC. It is not about residential schools. It is about Canada's colonialism. That is what it is a record of. It is about Canada's colonialism, using the residential schools as an entry point for breaking that apart. So this is important for awareness. The TRC is not about residential schools. It is about Canada's colonialism. And if you read the entire suite of documents carefully, which you probably won't do, I acknowledge that. Most of my colleagues don't even do that, and I admit I've read most of it, and then I do the scan because you can do a word search in it. So you can do a word search for physical education or physical or sport or recreation and go and see for yourself what turns up. But you can see how physical movement and physical culture is structured by and transmits ideas about what is acceptable and what it isn't, or what isn't, in terms of its relationship to the land, to the culture, and identity and health. That is what the TRC is about. It's a very clear document, or at least it's a great entry point for understanding the important role of physical education, recreation, sport in Indigenous lives, and how that has been transformed through the years. Another takeaway point is that the calls to action, the 94 calls to action, because it's got its own separate document in the suite of documents, needs to be understood and viewed as an interconnected whole, not as discrete items. So for instance, in the policy work that I do, most of our organizations, the partner organizations with that partner with the Aboriginal Sports Circle, for instance, they go straight to the calls to action on sport. They skip right to the end of the document and they go right to sport. And they go, easy, 5 calls to action, right on, check, check, check. And then we have to sit down and say, wait a minute, you don't understand the way sport, and I would include physical education in there, is connected to health, is connected to education, is connected to culture, is connected to land, is connected to identity. And we've just walked through like simple vignettes showing you how and why it's important to see things that way. So it needs to be understood and viewed as an interconnected whole, not as discrete elements. Another point is that physical education, physical culture is still more than sports and games. And I think you fundamentally understand that. I mean, I get the sense from the discussions that you're having here and from the work that you do, that what you do is more than fun and games. Now, my partner, he used to be a physical education teacher until I started moving around a lot, and then he became the guy who followed me around because of my jobs, and he's no longer a physical education teacher, which he's kind of kicking himself about because he'd probably be retired at about now. But he used to get so frustrated because he didn't get any respect, from his colleagues because he was the phys ed teacher. And he didn't have the language to explain to them why the work that he was doing is so important. Because what you're doing is much more than teaching fun and games. What you're doing is much more than teaching physical literacy. You're teaching valuable life skills. And that brings me to my second last point. Doing sports and games, or understanding sports in the residential schools, talking about sports and games, needs to be understood, not in positive or negative terms, just as it was in the CBC report that we looked at to open up the discussion. These positive or negative valuations are not helpful for talking about the history or the work that you do. At least that's the point that I'm trying to make, and that's what I try and avoid. Because what this does is it sets up a binary. I find this too often. People create this kind of mental checklist in their head, positive on one side, negative on the other. This is why we should do this, check, check, check. And if it's got more points on one side, then it's considered negative or it's considered positive. This sets up a binary, which is not a productive way to talk about reconciliation. If we instead frame the question of how is it that what we are doing is helping people to be better and stronger, then that sets up a different way of thinking the work that we do, the work that you do in the classroom, because then it becomes a discussion over struggles about how physical culture is fundamentally attached to a way of life. And so my final point relates to the one that I said earlier. I think physical education teachers and specialists play a critical role in the future making of Canada and play a role in reconciliation. And this is where I get back to the presence of the absence. I think the fact that your profession has been left out of the calls to action means that it is more important than the people were originally aware. The way we live in our bodies, the way we move our bodies, how we teach to move our bodies, what we think is acceptable, what we think is not acceptable, is an expression of who we are as a people, is an expression of what we think is right or not so appropriate about gender, for instance. How many of you have maybe an older woman in your family who think women, ladies, ought to sit a certain way? You are not to sit, for instance, in your chair, laid back with your arm across the other chair with your legs stretched out or, heaven forbid, apart. Ladies just don't sit that way. Or other assumptions, depending on the way people move their body. We live in our bodies, and our bodies are layered with meaning. Physical education plays a role in this, and it can play a role in decolonization. And so I think if we were to move ahead as physical education teachers, it's important to come to your classrooms with that sense of awareness and understanding. And it is important to have discussions then about the role that you can play in Indigenous lives in the future. So I'm going to leave it there, folks. I'm not sure what time I'm at. It's like a casino. There's just no clock. Thank you.